The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Dr. Sarah Mitchell's office on the 23rd floor of a Manhattan high-rise. The city stretched endlessly below, its lights beginning to flicker on as dusk approached. At 43, Michelle Thompson sat rigidly in the burgundy leather chair, her manicured fingers gripping a tissue that had long since become soggy from her tears. "I've scheduled this appointment 17 times over the past 3 years," Michelle whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the heating system. "Every time, I found an excuse to cancel. A work meeting, one of the kids getting sick, a family obligation." She paused, staring at the rain streaks on the window. "But the truth is, I was terrified." Dr. Mitchell, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, leaned forward slightly. Her office was carefully designed to feel safe: warm lighting, soft textures, and photographs of peaceful landscapes adorning the cream-colored walls. "What changed today, Michelle?" Dr. Mitchell asked gently. "What made you finally walk through that door?" Michelle's breath caught in her throat as memories flooded back. "Last week, my daughter Sophie came home from school with a permission slip for a field trip to a historical church in Lower Manhattan. When I saw it, I had a panic attack right there in our kitchen. David found me on the floor, hyperventilating." She closed her eyes, remembering the concerned look on her husband's face, the way their 8-year-old son Tommy had peeked around the corner with frightened eyes. "I've been carrying this weight for 25 years, Michelle continued, her voice growing stronger. "I thought I could just compartmentalize it, lock it away in some dark corner of my mind and live a normal life. I got married, had children, built a successful career as a marketing executive. From the outside, everything looks perfect." The therapist nodded encouragingly, making notes on her pad. Outside, the sounds of Manhattan rush hour created a distant symphony. Car horns, sirens, the rumble of subway trains deep underground. "But it's all been built on quicksand," Michelle whispered. "I wake up some nights drenched in sweat, and David finds me standing in the shower at 3 a.m., scrubbing my skin raw. I haven't set foot in a church since my wedding day, and even then, I was nauseous the entire ceremony." Michelle's voice cracked as she continued. "My children ask questions I can't answer. Why don't we go to church like their friends' families? Why do I change the channel when certain news stories come on? Why do I sometimes cry when I hear hymns playing in stores during Christmas?" The therapist set down her pen and looked directly at Michelle. "You mentioned this happened 25 years ago. You would have been 18? "Yes," Michelle nodded, her hands trembling. "I was a freshman at NYU, studying journalism. I had these big dreams of changing the world, of telling important stories that mattered." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "I never imagined I'd become a story myself, one I was too afraid to tell." The autumn light was fading outside, casting long shadows across the office. Michelle could see her reflection in the window. A successful woman in a tailored suit, perfectly styled hair, the image of someone who had it all together. But inside, she still felt like that 18-year-old girl, scared and alone. "I was struggling after my father's death that spring," Michelle began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad had been my anchor, my biggest supporter. When he died suddenly of a heart attack, I felt completely lost. My mother was dealing with her own grief, and I was drowning." Dr. Mitchell leaned forward with compassion. "Grief at 18 can feel overwhelming, especially when you're already navigating the challenges of being away from home for the first time." "Exactly," Michelle nodded. "I was searching for something, meaning comfort, guidance. A girl in my dorm, Sarah Chen, invited me to this community outreach program connected to a church in Manhattan. She said they had grief counseling groups, volunteer opportunities, a place where young people could find purpose and healing." Michelle paused, staring at her hands. It seemed like exactly what I needed. 3 weeks into therapy, Michelle had established a routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she would leave her corner office at the marketing firm early, taking the subway from Midtown to Dr. Mitchell's practice. The sessions had become an anchor in her week, a place where she could slowly untangle 25 years of buried trauma. On this particular Thursday afternoon, Michelle walked through Central Park after her session. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and roasted chestnuts from nearby vendors. Families pushed strollers along the winding paths. Joggers weaved between tourists, and the distant sound of street musicians created a soundtrack of city life. She found herself drawn to Bethesda Fountain, where she sat on a bench and watched children feeding ducks in the water. The scene was peaceful, yet her mind was churning with memories from that autumn of 1999. The community center was in a converted brownstone on the Upper West Side, Michelle had told Dr. Mitchell earlier that day. It was beautiful. High ceilings, stained glass windows, polished wooden floors that creaked when you walked. There was something about the place that felt sacred, protective. She remembered her first visit vividly. Sarah had led her through heavy oak doors into a warm, welcoming space filled with young people engaged in various activities. Some were tutoring children from the neighborhood, others were preparing meals for homeless shelters, and in the back room there was a grief support group meeting. Everyone was so kind, Michelle continued, her voice growing distant. The volunteers, the staff, the other young people dealing with loss. For the first time since Dad died, I felt like I wasn't alone, like maybe I could find my way through the darkness. The program coordinator, a charismatic figure in their 40s who commanded respect and admiration from everyone in the community, had taken a special interest in Michelle. They recognized her pain, her intelligence, her desire to make a difference in the world. They told me I had a gift for connecting with people in crisis, Michelle remembered, a sad smile crossing her face. They said I could help other young people going through what I was experiencing. It made me feel valuable, needed, like my pain could serve a purpose. Dr. Mitchell had asked careful questions, helping Michelle reconstruct those early days at the center. The genuine community work that was being done, the food drives, the tutoring programs, the legitimate grief counseling that helped dozens of young people process trauma and loss. For about 2 months, it was exactly what I needed, Michelle continued. I threw myself into volunteering, grateful for the distraction from my grief. I helped organize clothing drives for homeless shelters, tutored kids from the neighborhood, and even helped with some administrative work. The autumn leaves rustled overhead as Michelle sat by the fountain, remembering the gradual changes that had begun to occur. The extra attention from the coordinator, the special projects she was invited to help with, the private meetings that were supposedly about developing her leadership skills. There were warning signs, Michelle admitted to herself, watching a young woman about the same age she had been then. The way they would touch my shoulder when they spoke to me, lingering a little too long. The personal questions about my dating life, my relationship with my mother, my future plans, the gifts, books, small pieces of jewelry, things they said would help with my healing process. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through recent photos of her family. David at Sophie's soccer game, Tommy building a sandcastle during their summer vacation to the Hamptons, the 4 of them laughing around their dinner table in Brooklyn. This life she had built, was it all constructed on a foundation of unprocessed trauma? Her phone buzzed with a text from David. How was your session today? I'm making your favorite pasta for dinner. Love you. The simple message brought tears to her eyes. Her husband's unwavering support over the past few weeks had been both a lifeline and a source of guilt. How had she kept this secret from him for their entire 10-year marriage? I started spending more time at the center, Michelle remembered, her voice hollow during that day's therapy session. Sometimes I'd be there from after classes until late evening. The coordinator convinced me that I was too important to the community to maintain normal boundaries. They said exceptional people like me needed exceptional guidance. Dr. Mitchell had nodded knowingly. Predators often use their victims' desire to help others and their personal vulnerabilities as a way to justify inappropriate behavior. The word predator had hit Michelle like a physical blow. For 25 years, she had struggled to name what had happened to her, to categorize the experience that had shaped her entire adult life. As evening approached and the park began to empty, Michelle made her way back to the subway. The familiar journey home to Brooklyn gave her time to process the day's revelations. Each therapy session was like carefully removing layers of gauze from a wound that had never properly healed. She thought about the journal Dr. Mitchell had encouraged her to keep, the homework assignments of writing down specific memories, the gradual process of reconstructing not just what had happened, but how it had affected every aspect of her life since. The train rumbled through the tunnel beneath the East River, carrying her back to her family, back to the life she was fighting so hard to reclaim and heal. December arrived in New York with an early snowfall that blanketed the city in pristine white, temporarily muffling the constant urban symphony. Michelle stood at her kitchen window in their Park Slope brownstone, watching 8-year-old Sophie and 6-year-old Tommy build a snowman in their small backyard. The scene should have filled her with joy, but instead she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had become her constant companion. The breakthrough had come 3 days earlier, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Michelle had been reviewing her email while drinking her first cup of coffee when Sophie bounded into the kitchen, her dark curls bouncing with excitement. "Mom, guess what?" Sophie had announced, waving a crumpled piece of paper. "We're going on a field trip to see the Christmas pageant at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Mrs. Rodriguez says it's been a tradition for 4th graders for over 20 years. The permission slip had fluttered to the floor as Michelle's hands began to shake uncontrollably. The familiar symptoms crashed over her like a tidal wave. Racing heartbeat, difficulty breathing, the sensation that the walls were closing in around her. But this time was different. This time, her daughter was watching. "Mommy?" Sophie's voice had seemed to come from very far away. "Mommy, what's wrong?" David had found Michelle on the bathroom floor 20 minutes later, hyperventilating into a paper bag while Sophie sat beside her, stroking her hair with the gentle wisdom that children sometimes possess in crisis moments. "Did something bad happen at church, Mommy?" Sophie had asked quietly, her 8-year-old intuition cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Now, 3 days later, Michelle was still reeling from the intensity of that panic attack and from Sophie's innocent but devastating question. Dr. Mitchell had explained that children often pick up on their parents' unprocessed trauma in ways that adults miss. The evening of the panic attack, after the children were in bed, Michelle and David had sat in their living room with the Christmas tree twinkling in the corner, its lights casting dancing shadows on the walls. The presents underneath, wrapped in cheerful paper, seemed to mock the darkness Michelle was finally ready to confront. "David, I need to tell you something I should have shared years ago," Michelle had begun, her voice trembling like autumn leaves in the wind. Her husband of 10 years had set down his book and turned to face her fully. David was a pediatric nurse at Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, a man whose entire career was built on caring for vulnerable children and supporting families in crisis. His calm presence and infinite patience were among the qualities that had drawn Michelle to him, though she'd never fully understood why she needed those particular traits in a partner. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together," David had said simply, taking her hands in his larger ones. The words had tumbled out then, 25 years of buried truth spilling across their living room like water breaking through a dam. Michelle told him about the community center, about the coordinator who had gained her trust during her most vulnerable time, about the gradual erosion of boundaries that she had been too young and too traumatized by grief to recognize as manipulation. She told him about the private counseling sessions that had slowly become something else entirely, about the confusion and shame that had followed her into every relationship since. She explained why she sometimes woke up in cold sweats, why certain touches made her freeze, why she'd never been able to fully relax even in their most intimate moments. David had listened without interruption, his face cycling through shock, anger, and finally, protective tenderness. When she finished speaking, they had both been crying. "I'm so sorry," he had whispered, pulling her into his arms. "I'm sorry that happened to you, and I'm sorry you've been carrying this alone for so long." "I wanted to tell you," Michelle had sobbed into his shoulder, "so many times over the years, but I was afraid you'd see me differently, that you'd think I was damaged, that maybe you wouldn't want to be married to someone who—" "Stop," David had said firmly, pulling back to look directly into her eyes. "Michelle, you are not damaged. You're not responsible for what was done to you. You were 18 years old, grieving your father, and someone in a position of trust violated that trust in the most fundamental way." They had talked until nearly dawn, David asking gentle questions that helped Michelle articulate experiences she had never put into words. He held her when she cried, brought her tissues when her voice gave out, and never once made her feel like her trauma was too much for him to handle. "What do you need from me?" he had asked as the first light of morning began to filter through their curtains. "I need you to be patient while I figure out how to heal from this," Michelle had replied. "I need you to understand that some days might be harder than others, and I need you to know that everything good in my life, our marriage, our children, the woman I've become, it's all real. This thing that happened, it's part of my story, but it's not the whole story." David had nodded, kissing her forehead gently. "We'll get through this together. Whatever you need, more therapy, couples counseling, space to process, time to heal, whatever it takes. Now, watching her children play in the snow while David prepared hot chocolate in the kitchen, Michelle felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. Hope, the secret that had lived inside her like a poison, was finally out, shared with the person who mattered most. The shame was beginning to loosen its grip on her heart. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Mitchell. "How are you feeling after our conversation yesterday about telling David? Remember, healing isn't linear, and you're showing incredible courage." Michelle smiled, typing back, "Scared but hopeful. He wants to come to a session with me next week if that's okay." The response came quickly. "Of course. Healing often involves the whole family system. You're doing beautiful work, Michelle." January in New York brought bitter cold and a fresh sense of possibility. Michelle had established new routines in the weeks following her conversation with David. Individual therapy twice a week, couples counseling once a week, and a commitment to honesty with her children that was age-appropriate but authentic. The most significant addition to her week was Thursday evenings at a support group meeting in a small community center near Union Square. Dr. Mitchell had suggested it after several weeks of individual work, explaining that connecting with other survivors often accelerated the healing process. "I was terrified the first time I walked into that room," Michelle later told David over dinner at their favorite restaurant in Carroll Gardens. "I kept thinking, what if someone recognizes me? What if I don't belong here? What if my trauma isn't significant enough compared to others?" The support group met in the basement of an old church that had been converted into a community center. A detail that wasn't lost on Michelle, though Dr. Mitchell had carefully chosen this particular group because of their sensitivity to religious trauma. The room was painted a soothing sage green, with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle and inspirational quotes from various traditions adorning the walls. "My name is Michelle, and this is my first time here," she had said during that initial meeting, her voice barely above a whisper. I experienced abuse in a religious setting 25 years ago, and I'm just starting to understand how it's affected my entire adult life." The group was led by Dr. Carmen Rodriguez, a trauma specialist who had survived her own experience with institutional abuse. The other members varied in age from early 20s to late 60s, representing a cross-section of New York's diversity. There was Maria, a high school teacher from the Bronx who had been abused by a coach in her teens. James, a Wall Street executive whose trauma had occurred in a boarding school. Rebecca, a young mother dealing with childhood religious trauma. Each person's story was unique, yet the common threads were unmistakable. "The first thing I want you to know," Dr. Rodriguez had said during Michelle's first meeting, "is that trauma doesn't have a hierarchy. Your pain is valid regardless of what others have experienced. Healing isn't a competition. It's a journey we take together." Over the following weeks, Michelle found herself looking forward to Thursday evenings in ways she hadn't anticipated. The group had become a sanctuary where she could speak truths that had been locked inside her for decades. She learned new vocabulary for her experiences, terms like grooming, spiritual abuse, and complex trauma that helped her understand the systematic nature of what had happened to her. "I've started having these moments," Michelle shared during her fourth meeting, "where I remember things I thought I'd forgotten. Not just the worst parts, but also the ways I tried to protect myself, the small rebellions, the times I knew something was wrong even when I couldn't name it." Maria, who had become a particular source of support, nodded knowingly. "That's your inner wisdom coming back online. Trauma can shut down our intuition, but healing restores it." Between group meetings, Michelle had begun writing in earnest. What started as simple journaling exercises assigned by Dr. Mitchell had evolved into something more substantial, a detailed account of her experiences, her healing process, and the ways that unaddressed trauma had shaped her relationships, career choices, and parenting style. "I realize I've been unconsciously protecting my children from experiences I can't even name," Michelle wrote in her journal one evening while David graded papers at their kitchen table. "I've never let them sleep over at friends' houses, never allowed them to join youth groups, never left them alone with adults I don't know extremely well. I thought I was just being a careful parent, but really, I was projecting my own trauma onto their childhood." The writing process was both painful and liberating. Some nights, Michelle would write until 2 or 3 in the morning, the words pouring out of her like water from a broken dam. Other nights, she could barely manage a sentence before the memories became too overwhelming. David had become her anchor during this process, bringing her tea during late-night writing sessions, holding her when the memories became too intense, and celebrating small victories along the way. "I'm proud of you," he told her one evening after she'd shared a particularly difficult piece of writing. "I know this is hard, but you're not just healing yourself. You're breaking a cycle, creating a healthier legacy for our children." The support group had also introduced Michelle to the concept of post-traumatic growth, the idea that trauma, while devastating, could also become a source of strength, wisdom, and purpose. She began to see how her experiences had made her particularly attuned to others' pain, especially skilled at creating safe spaces for vulnerable people. "I think I understand now why I chose marketing as a career," Michelle shared with the group during her 8th week. "It's all about understanding what people need, what motivates them, how to build trust. But I've only been using those skills to sell products. What if I use them to help people instead?" Dr. Rodriguez smiled. "What would that look like for you?" "I don't know yet," Michelle admitted. "But for the first time in 25 years, I'm excited to find out." Spring arrived in New York with an explosion of cherry blossoms in Prospect Park and a sense of renewal that Michelle felt in her bones. 6 months into her healing journey, she had reached a milestone she never thought possible. She was ready to speak publicly about her experience. The decision hadn't come suddenly. It had grown slowly over weeks of therapy, support group meetings, and long conversations with David and Dr. Mitchell. The catalyst had been a news story about institutional abuse that had sent Michelle into a familiar panic spiral. But this time, instead of shame, she felt anger. Productive, righteous anger about systems that failed to protect vulnerable people. "I want to contact a journalist," Michelle had announced during a therapy session in early April. Not for revenge, not to destroy anyone personally, but to shine a light on how institutions can better protect young people who are seeking guidance during vulnerable times. Dr. Mitchell had leaned forward with interest. "Tell me more about what's driving this decision." "I keep thinking about my daughter, about my son, about all the young people who are going through loss and trauma right now," Michelle explained, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "What if Sophie experiences a crisis at 18 and turns to a religious community for support? What if Tommy needs guidance someday and encounters someone who takes advantage of his vulnerability? I can't protect every child, but maybe I can help create better systems of protection." The process of going public was more complex than Michelle had anticipated. Dr. Mitchell referred her to a lawyer who specialized in institutional abuse cases, not for litigation, but to understand her rights and protections as someone speaking out about historical trauma. The lawyer, Patricia Chen, no relation to Michelle's college friend Sarah, explained the landscape of institutional accountability and the ways that survivors' stories could contribute to systemic change without necessarily pursuing legal action. "Your story has power precisely because you're not seeking personal gain," Patricia explained during their first meeting in her Tribeca office. "Survivors who speak out for the purpose of protecting others often have the greatest impact on institutional reform." Michelle also consulted with a media relations specialist recommended by her employer, someone who could help her navigate the process of sharing her story with dignity and appropriate boundaries. The specialist, Marcus Williams, had experience working with survivors of various forms of institutional abuse. "The key is finding the right journalist," Marcus explained. "Someone who understands trauma-informed reporting, who won't sensationalize your experience or pressure you to share details you're not comfortable making public." After careful research and several preliminary conversations, Michelle chose to work with Sophia Reyes, an investigative journalist with the New York Times who had built a reputation for sensitive, thorough reporting on institutional abuse and systemic failures in youth-serving organizations. Their first meeting took place on a warm May afternoon at a quiet cafe in Greenwich Village. Sophia was younger than Michelle had expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with an earnest manner and careful questions that immediately put Michelle at ease. "I want you to know that this process is entirely under your control," Sophia explained over coffee and pastries. "You decide what details to share, how much of your personal life to include, and what aspects of your story to emphasize. My role is to help you tell your truth in a way that serves your goals." Michelle spent several hours across multiple meetings sharing her story with Sophia, who took careful notes and asked thoughtful follow-up questions. The journalist was particularly interested in the institutional structures that had enabled the abuse, the lack of oversight, the informal mentorship programs, the ways that legitimate community work had provided cover for inappropriate behavior. "What I find compelling about your story," Sophia explained, "is that it illustrates how abuse can occur even within organizations that are doing genuinely good work. It's not about demonizing religious communities or youth programs, but about creating better safeguards and accountability measures." The fact-checking process was exhaustive. Sophia spent weeks verifying details of Michelle's account, consulting with experts on institutional abuse, and researching the specific organization where Michelle's trauma had occurred. She discovered that Michelle wasn't the first person to report concerning behavior from the coordinator, though previous reports had been handled internally and never resulted in meaningful consequences. Meanwhile, Michelle was navigating complex family dynamics around her decision to go public. Her mother, Catherine, had initially struggled to understand why Michelle was rehashing the past after so many years. "I just don't see what good can come from dragging all this up now," Catherine had said during a difficult phone conversation. "You've built such a beautiful life. Why risk disrupting it?" Michelle's sister Jennifer, however, had been immediately supportive. "I'm proud of you," Jennifer had said during a sister's lunch in Soho. "I always knew something happened during that period when you were in college. You changed after Dad died, but then you changed again, became more guarded. I could never put my finger on it." The most challenging conversation had been with Sophie and Tommy. Michelle and David had worked with a family therapist to determine how much to share with children their ages and how to frame the conversation in age-appropriate terms. "Sometimes adults who work with young people make bad choices," Michelle had explained to her children one evening after dinner. "Something like that happened to Mommy when she was in college, and it made me sad and scared for a long time. But now I'm getting help to feel better, and I'm going to tell my story to help make sure other young people are safer." Sophie, with her 8-year-old directness, had asked, "Is that why we don't go to church?" "Partly, yes," Michelle had answered honestly. "But that doesn't mean all churches are bad places. It just means we have to be careful and make sure that any place we go to has good rules to protect people." The article was published on a Sunday morning in late June, appearing both in the print edition of the New York Times and prominently featured on their website. Michelle had prepared for this moment for weeks, but nothing could have readied her for the immediate and overwhelming response. She sat in her favorite corner of their Park Slope home, legs curled under her on the window seat that looked out onto their tree-lined street. David had made her favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes with fresh whipped cream, and the children were playing quietly in the backyard, giving her space to process the milestone. The headline read, "Breaking Institutional Silence, a Survivor's 25-Year Journey to Find Her Voice." Sophia Reyes had crafted the piece with extraordinary sensitivity, focusing on the systemic issues that had enabled Michelle's abuse while respecting her privacy and dignity. The article highlighted the importance of proper oversight in youth-serving organizations, the need for trauma-informed training for religious leaders, and the long-term impact of institutional abuse on survivors. Michelle's phone had been buzzing constantly since dawn. Text messages from friends and colleagues expressing support, emails from strangers thanking her for her courage, and calls from advocacy organizations asking if she would be willing to speak at conferences or contribute to policy discussions. "I feel like I'm living in someone else's life," Michelle told David, as he sat beside her on the window seat. "6 months ago, I couldn't even say the words out loud. Now thousands of people are reading my story." One message particularly moved her. A long email from a young woman named Alex who was currently struggling with inappropriate behavior from a mentor in her graduate program. "Reading your story helped me realize that what I'm experiencing isn't normal," Alex had written. "I thought I was overreacting, but your article helped me understand that I have the right to trust my instincts and seek help." Dr. Mitchell had warned Michelle that going public might trigger unexpected emotional responses, both positive and challenging. Survivors often experience a mixture of relief and vulnerability after sharing their stories, she had explained. It's normal to feel proud of your courage while also feeling exposed and raw. The accuracy of this prediction became apparent over the following days. Michelle felt simultaneously empowered and emotionally exhausted. She was proud of her decision to speak out, but she also found herself needing extra support as strangers approached her on the subway, colleagues looked at her differently, and she navigated the complexity of being publicly identified as a survivor. 3 weeks after the article's publication, Michelle received an unexpected phone call. Columbia University's School of Social Work was hosting a symposium on institutional abuse prevention and wanted to invite her to speak on a panel about survivor perspectives on systemic reform. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Michelle had initially told Dr. Rodriguez during their support group meeting. "It's one thing to write my story, but speaking publicly feels like another level entirely." "What feels scary about it?" Dr. Rodriguez asked. "What if I break down? What if I can't find the words? What if people ask questions I'm not prepared to answer?" Maria, her fellow group member, had smiled encouragingly. "Michelle, you've been finding your words for months now. You've done the hard work of healing. Maybe it's time to trust that the words will be there when you need them." After extensive discussion with David, Dr. Mitchell, and her support group, Michelle decided to accept the speaking invitation. She spent weeks preparing, working with a public speaking coach to develop techniques for staying grounded if she became overwhelmed, and crafting talking points that felt authentic to her experience. The symposium took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Michelle had first walked into Dr. Mitchell's office. The auditorium at Columbia was filled with social workers, religious leaders, youth program administrators, and advocates for abuse prevention. Michelle stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, and felt a calm she hadn't expected. David sat in the third row, giving her an encouraging smile. Dr. Mitchell was in the audience, along with several members of her support group who had come to show solidarity. 25 years ago, I thought my voice didn't matter," Michelle began, her words clear and strong. "I was 18 years old, grieving my father's death, and I placed my trust in an institution that I believed would help me heal. Instead, someone in a position of authority violated that trust in ways that affected every aspect of my life for the next 2.5 decades. She spoke about the importance of believing survivors, the need for robust oversight in youth-serving organizations, and the possibility of post-traumatic growth. She shared statistics about the prevalence of institutional abuse and practical recommendations for creating safer environments. "I'm not here to demonize religious communities or youth programs," Michelle continued. "The organization where I was harmed also did genuine good in the community. Many people were truly helped there. But good intentions are not enough. We need systemic changes, proper background checks, clear boundaries training, transparent reporting mechanisms, and cultures that prioritize the safety of vulnerable people over the reputation of institutions." The most powerful moment came during the question and answer session, when a young seminary student asked, "What would you want religious leaders to know about supporting survivors?" Michelle paused, thinking about her 18-year-old self, about Sophie and Tommy, about all the young people seeking guidance during difficult times. "I would want them to know that healing is possible, but it requires more than just individual therapy," she answered. "It requires institutions taking responsibility for the ways their systems may have failed, making concrete changes to prevent future harm, and creating spaces where survivors feel truly heard and valued, not just tolerated." As the symposium concluded and people began to filter out of the auditorium, Michelle was approached by dozens of attendees, some sharing their own stories, others asking for advice on implementing prevention programs, and many simply thanking her for her courage. 6 months later, Michelle made another significant decision. She left her marketing career to join a nonprofit organization focused on institutional abuse prevention, using her professional skills to help create safer environments for young people across the country. "I finally understand what I'm supposed to do with my life," she told David one evening as they walked through Prospect Park with Sophie and Tommy running ahead of them. "Everything I've experienced, the trauma, the healing, the skills I've developed, it all led me to this work." The autumn light filtered through the trees, casting golden patterns on the path ahead. Michelle felt something she had never thought possible: complete peace with her story. The 18-year-old girl who had been silenced had found her voice, and in doing so had created pathways for countless others to find theirs. As they walked home through their neighborhood, Sophie ran back to take Michelle's hand. "Mom, I'm proud of you," her daughter said with the simple clarity that children possess. Michelle squeezed her daughter's hand, thinking about the legacy she was creating, not just of survival, but of transformation, advocacy, and hope. The girl who had once been silenced by shame and fear had become a woman whose voice carried the power to create change. Her healing journey would continue, but she was no longer walking it alone. And most importantly, she was using her voice to ensure that fewer young people would have to walk it at all.